you found Scary Mary. Settle in, let your shoulders drop, and feel your breath slow down. Tonight's story is real and quiet, like the space between heartbeats. These are scary stories for brave dreams. Support the channel with a like, a comment, or a subscription. Your presence keeps the night alive. Close your eyes. The city of Milwaukee, in the spring of 1960, was a study in post-industrial patience. Nestled against the vast, freshwater expanse of Lake Michigan, it was a city built on the sturdy, unglamorous foundations of brewing and heavy machinery. The air, particularly in the nascent warmth of a Midwestern May, carried the low, sweet odor of malt from the Schlitz and Pabst breweries, a scent that mingled with the metallic tang from the factories and the damp, mineral breath of the lake. It was a city of hard work and hard drinking, of neighborhoods defined by ethnicity and the quiet, unspoken rhythms of blue-collar life. On May 21, in the suburb of West Alleys, in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, Joyce Annette Dahmer, née Flint, gave birth to her first son. He was named Jeffrey Lionel. From the very beginning, there was a tension in the Dahmer household, a low-frequency hum of discontent that would form the backdrop of Jeffrey's earliest consciousness. His father, Lionel, was a chemist, a man whose world was one of precise measurements, predictable reactions, and empirical truths. He was quiet, methodical, and emotionally reserved, finding more solace in the orderly logic of his work than in the messy, unpredictable realm of family life. Joyce, in stark contrast, was a vortex of need and anxiety. A former schoolteacher, she was high-strung, prone to dramatic mood swings, and increasingly consumed by a cocktail of prescription medications and her own internal phantoms. Her world was not one of facts, but of feelings, and her feelings were often storms of hysteria, paranoia, and profound, debilitating depression. The Dahmer home, first in West Alleys and later in the more rural Doylestown, Ohio, was not a haven. It was a battlefield where two incompatible temperaments waged a cold war. The arguments were not always loud. Sometimes, the most devastating salvos were fired in silence. A slammed door, a meal eaten in stony silence, the weight of a grievance so heavy it seemed to bend the very air in the room. Jeffrey, a sensitive and observant child, learned to navigate this emotional minefield with a strategy of stealth and withdrawal. He became a ghost in his own home, a small, blonde-haired boy who moved quietly through the halls, trying to take up as little space as possible, to make as little noise as he could, lest he attract the unpredictable lightning of his mother's temper, or the weary, distant gaze of his father. His refuge was the outdoors. Behind their house in Doylestown lay a small, untamed world of woods and fields. It was here that his peculiar, nascent fascination with the mechanics of life and death began to blossom. While other boys might collect baseball cards or build model airplanes, Jeffrey collected the remains of the natural world. He was not a torturer of living things. There was no evidence of the sadist's glee. Instead, he was a morbid naturalist, a collector of permanence from the flux of decay. He would carefully gather the bodies of squirrels, chipmunks, and birds that had succumbed to the indifferent forces of nature or the local traffic. He would arrange them in shoebox coffins, bury them with a child's solemnity, and then, driven by an insatiable curiosity, he would later exhume them. He was captivated by the process of decomposition, by the strange alchemy that stripped away the vibrant, fleeting essence of life to reveal the stark, white architecture of the skeleton. This was not, to his young mind, grotesque. It was beautiful in its starkness, its truth. The bone was what remained. The flesh was temporary, a soft and vulnerable shell. He began preserving the skeletons, articulating them with wire, storing them in jars of formaldehyde that he pilfered from his father's workbench. This was his secret world, a kingdom of quiet and order, where the chaos of emotion was absent, and only the clean, final facts of bone and sinew remained. It was a world he could control absolutely. This solitary pursuit was a symptom of a deeper, more profound loneliness. He felt unseen. His mother, wrapped in the gauze of her own neuroses, would swing between smothering, anxious affection and distant, irritable rejection. His father, when he was present, would occasionally try to engage his son in projects, a chemistry set, a go-kart. But these interactions were often awkward, more about instruction than connection. Lionel saw the strange collections of bones, and while concerned, dismissed it as a macabre, but ultimately harmless phase of boyhood. He did not see the deep, existential hunger it represented. He did not hear the silent, screaming question his son was asking about the nature of existence, about what lasts and what fades, about what it means to have control in a world where he felt he had none. As he entered adolescence, the family moved again to a more isolated house in Bath Township, Ohio. The isolation intensified everything. The tensions at home escalated towards their inevitable climax. Joyce's mental state deteriorated further. Lionel spent more and more time at work. Jeffrey, now a teenager, was left to his own devices in the echoing, tense house. His laboratory moved from the woods to a backyard shed. The experiments escalated. He acquired a manual on animal taxidermy and began to practice with an almost religious fervor. The pinnacle or nadir of this period was the acquisition of a full, road-killed dog. He decapitated it and immersed the head in a jar of acid, patiently waiting for the flesh to dissolve, leaving only the pristine skull. He later mounted the body of the animal, a crude, unsettling effigy. At school, he was a pariah. The other teenagers, with their burgeoning social lives, their interest in sports and dating, their easy, loud camaraderie, sensed his otherness instinctively. He was painfully shy, awkward in his movements, and his strange, intense hobbies, when they became known, marked him as a freak. He was the target of relentless bullying. The nicknames Monster, Weirdo were hurled at him in the hallways. He had no friends. He would eat his lunch alone, a solitary figure at a corner table, or sometimes skip the cafeteria altogether to wander the woods. The chasm between him and the world of normal human interaction widened into an unbridgeable abyss. It was during this time that he began to drink heavily. Alcohol was a miracle cure. It was a chemical key that unlocked the prison of his shyness, dampened the constant, buzzing anxiety, and filled the vast, empty silence within him with a warm, buzzing static. He started drinking before school, smuggling vodka in a flask, the liquid courage allowing him to numb himself to the taunts and the profound sense of not belonging. The drinking became a constant, a self-medication for a sickness of the soul he could not name, and beneath it all, another secret was stirring, one that filled him with even more shame and confusion than his morbid collections: his emerging homosexuality. In the conservative, blue-collar world of 1970s Ohio, this was not an identity to be celebrated. It was a deviance to be hidden, a sin to be repressed. It compounded his feeling of being a permanent outsider, a flawed being who could never hope to fit into the simple, heterosexual narrative of the American dream that surrounded him. His desires became tangled with his loneliness and his obsession with possession. He didn't just want to be with someone. He began to fantasize about having someone completely and totally, in a way that would make it impossible for them to ever leave him, to ever reject him. The seeds of a terrifying solution to the problem of human connection were being planted in the dark, fertile soil of his isolation. The summer of 1978 was the crucible. He was 18 years old. The war between his parents had reached its final, devastating conclusion. The house was a pressure cooker of screamed accusations and slammed doors. Joyce, on the verge of a complete breakdown, was preparing to leave, taking Jeffrey's younger brother, David, with her. Lionel was distracted, furious, and helpless. The structure of Jeffrey's world, fragile as it was shattering. On June 18, desperate to escape the toxic atmosphere, he took one of his long, solitary drives. It was on this drive that he saw a hitchhiker. His name was Stephen Mark Hicks. He was 19, handsome, easygoing, on his way to a rock concert. On an impulse, Dahmer picked him up. They went back to the empty Dahmer house. They drank beer. They talked. For a few hours, the crushing weight of Jeffrey Dahmer's loneliness lifted. Here was a handsome, charismatic young man, giving him attention, sharing his company. It felt like a connection, a glimpse of the normal social interaction that had always been denied to him. And as the afternoon wore on, the thought of this ending, of Stephen Hicks walking out the door and back into his own vibrant life, became an intolerable prospect. The impending return of the silence, the emptiness, felt like a physical threat. When Hicks announced he had to leave, something in Dahmer fractured. The fear of abandonment, the rage at his own powerlessness, the years of bottled-up isolation, and the dark, possessive fantasies coalesced into a single, catastrophic impulse. He picked up a barbell and struck Hicks on the head. The act was not premeditated in detail, but it was the inevitable eruption of a psychic pressure that had been building for 18 years. It was clumsy, frantic, and brutally effective. In a matter of moments, the connection was severed, not by departure, but by death. The vibrant young man was now a still, silent object. In the profound quiet that followed, a new, terrifying calm descended upon Dahmer. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a methodical, detached focus. He was alone with the body, but this time he was in control. The person who could leave was gone, but the physical vessel remained, and he could keep it. He dragged the body to the crawl space beneath the house. In the following days, he dismembered it, a grim, logistical process learned from his years of animal dissection. He wrapped the parts in plastic bags and buried them in the woods behind his property. Later, plagued by the fear of discovery, he returned, exhumed the remains, and pulverized the bones with a sledgehammer, scattering the fragments. The monster had been born, not in a flash of demonic possession, but in the slow, steady accumulation of silence, neglect, and a loneliness so profound that it could only conceive of one absolute, horrific way to end it. He had discovered a way to make a moment of connection permanent. And then he cleaned up, and life, such as it was, went on. He graduated from high school. His mother left. His father moved away. The world, oblivious, continued to turn, while deep in the woods of Ohio, and deeper still in the psyche of Jeffrey Dahmer, a darkness had taken root, and it was waiting for its next chance to feed. The summer after Stephen Hicks's murder was a season of ghosts. The Dahmer house in Bath Township was now a hollowed-out shell. Joyce and David were gone, the air still vibrating with the aftermath of their departure. Lionel was a specter himself, haunting the rooms with his own failure and disappointment. His attempts to connect with his eldest son now filtered through a fog of mutual incomprehension. For Jeffrey, the house was no longer a place of tension. It was a museum of his own secret. Every creak of the floorboard, every shadow in the corner of the yard seemed to whisper of what lay buried in the woods. The act of violence had paradoxically bestowed upon him a perverse sense of calm. The unbearable internal pressure had found a release valve, however monstrous. But the relief was temporary, and the silence that followed was now of a different, heavier quality, a silence shared with a ghost. That fall, propelled by some dim, residual notion of what a normal life should look like. He enrolled at Ohio State University in Columbus. It was a catastrophic miscalculation thrust into the boisterous, communal chaos of a university campus. He was like a deep-sea creature suddenly hauled into the blinding sun. The social demands were a form of torture. He possessed none of the tools for camaraderie, for small talk, for the easy forging of connections that defined the college experience. The loud parties in the dorms, the study groups in the libraries, the casual friendships formed over cafeteria meals, all of it was a foreign language he could not speak. He retreated instantly. He secured a single room off campus, a cell where he could barricade himself against the world. He skipped his classes with a thoroughness that was itself a kind of dedication. His life narrowed to a simple, grim routine: the purchase of alcohol and the consumption of it alone in his room. The days blurred into a drunken stupor, a chemical fog in which the memory of Ohio and the anxieties of the present could be drowned. He was not a student. He was a hermit who happened to occupy space near a university. The experiment in normality lasted one semester. Ohio State expelled him for non-attendance. The first thread tying him to the conventional world had been cut. Lionel, ever the pragmatist, saw the problem not as one of profound psychological distress, but of a lack of discipline. In the winter of 1979, he made a decisive intervention. He enlisted Jeffrey in the United States Army. It was, on the surface, a logical move. The Army would provide the structure, the purpose, the rigid external framework that his son so clearly lacked. It would tear him from his isolation and force him into a community. For a time, it seemed to work. The Army, in its own way, was another world where silence was a virtue. It valued obedience over individuality, action over introspection. Dahmer was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 68th Armor Regiment in Baumholder, West Germany, and trained as a combat medic. The role was a darkly perfect fit. It engaged his long-standing clinical fascination with the human body, its vulnerabilities, its mechanics, its capacity for damage and repair. He learned about anatomy, trauma, and pharmaceuticals. He was competent, if unremarkable. The relentless routine of drills, inspections, and exercises provided a carapace for his chaos. For a few hours a day, he could simply follow orders, and in the following of orders, there was a reprieve from the need to make choices, to navigate the terrifying wilderness of his own desires. But the monster had not been exorcised. It had only been temporarily regimented. The drinking, which had been his solace in Ohio, became his defining characteristic in the Army. It was no longer a private vice, but a public spectacle. His binges were legendary. He would disappear for days on end, found later in a drunken coma in his barracks or in a local German tavern. He was a blackout drinker, seeking not merriment, but annihilation. The alcohol was the only tool he had to sand down the sharp edges of his reality, to blur the memory of a bludgeoned skull in an Ohio basement, and to quiet the hum of the obsessive thoughts that were beginning to stir once more. His superiors charged him with drunkenness on multiple occasions. He was a problem, a broken cog in the well-oiled machine. The Army, like Ohio State, eventually ran out of patience in March of 1981. After just over 2 years of service, he was discharged for his chronic alcoholism. The second thread had been cut. He was once again cast adrift, this time with a passport stamped under other than honorable conditions, and a few $100s in mustering out pay. He had no home to return to. His father had moved to Wisconsin. His mother was a distant, broken figure. He drifted south, ending up in Miami Beach, Florida. The setting was a surreal contrast to the grim order of a West German military base and the gray skies of the Midwest. Miami was a city of vibrant, almost aggressive life, of neon and decadence, of beautiful bodies on sun-drenched beaches. Dahmer was a ghost in this paradise. He took a room in a shabby, pastel-colored motel, a transient box that smelled of mildew and disappointment. He found work making sub-sandwiches at a shop called the Shamrock Sandwich and Sub Shop. A job of profound insignificance that involved the repetitive, mind-numbing assembly of food for tourists. His life had been reduced to its most basic elements: work, drink, sleep. He was a non-entity, a blank space in the bustling crowd. It was here, in the sweltering Florida heat, that the pressure began to build again. The memory of the power, the absolute control he had exerted over Stephen Hicks, began to call to him from across the years. The alcoholic stupor was no longer enough to keep it at bay. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollowed out feeling in his gut that the cheap beer and vodka could no longer fill. In September of 1981, he was arrested for drunken and disorderly conduct. It was a minor offense, but it was a signal. The container was cracking. He called his father. Defeated, penniless, and lost, he asked to come to Wisconsin. Lionel, still clinging to the hope of rehabilitation, agreed. He arranged for Jeffrey to live with his grandmother, Catherine Jemima Dahmer, in the quiet, working-class suburb of West Allis, Wisconsin. It was a return to his roots, a circling back to the place of his birth, under the roof of the one person who might still offer unconditional, grandmotherly love. Catherine's home on West Allis Avenue was a sanctuary of normalcy. It was clean, orderly, and smelled of cooked meals and furniture polish. To her, Jeffrey was not a monster or a failure. He was her grandson, a troubled young man who needed a stable home and a firm but loving hand. She provided him with a room, home-cooked meals, and a sense of family structure he had not known since early childhood. For a time, the strategy seemed to work. He found a job at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company in Milwaukee, working the night shift as a mixer. The job was monotonous, but it was steady. The sweet, cloying scent of melting chocolate that permeated the factory was a stark, almost comical contrast to the chemical and deathly odors that would later define his life. He was, to all outward appearances, stabilizing. He was a quiet man who lived with his grandmother, went to work, and caused no trouble. But the monster was only hibernating, and its lair was his grandmother's basement. The job at the chocolate factory suited his nocturnal nature. He would sleep during the day and work through the night, a creature of the shadows. And it was in the shadows of Milwaukee's gay district that he began to hunt again. The city's bathhouses and gay bars in the 1980s were havens for men seeking connection and community, often in the face of a hostile, uncomprehending world. For Dahmer, they were not places of community. They were markets for objects. He was not looking for a relationship or even fleeting intimacy in the conventional sense. He was looking for men who were themselves on the margins, runaways, sex workers, men of color who were often overlooked by the wider society. Men who, like him, were invisible. He would lure them back to his grandmother's basement with promises of money for posing for photographs, or with the simple, powerful bait of alcohol and companionship. The basement became his new laboratory, a grim echo of the shed in Ohio. Here, his obsession evolved from simple murder to a more complex, more horrifying ritual. The killing was no longer just an end in itself. It was a means to a more grandiose, more deranged goal. He began experimenting with drugs, not to kill, but to subdue. He would mix powerful sedatives, stolen or procured through his old army medic connections, into their drinks. His fantasy was to create a compliant, zombie-like state, a living being who would not leave, who would not reject him, who would be entirely his to control. A perfect, passive companion. He wanted to negate the will of another human being, to reduce a person to a living doll. The experiments were crude, desperate, and almost always fatal. The doses were wrong, the methods flawed. Men would slip into comas from which they would never wake, or they would die from the combination of drugs and alcohol. And Dahmer would be left, once again, with a corpse. But a corpse was not what he truly wanted. The act of dismemberment that followed was not just a means of disposal. It was a sacrament of possession, a way to assert a final, absolute ownership over the object of his failed desire. He began keeping body parts, skulls, skeletons, organs as trophies. He would clean the skulls, bleach them, sometimes even paint them with gray model paint, attempting to preserve a piece, a relic, of the person he had desired. He took Polaroid photographs of the bodies in various stages of dissection, a chilling catalog of his attempts to understand, to own, to conquer the ultimate loneliness. His grandmother, Catherine, began to notice things. Strange, chemical smells would waft up from the basement. The acrid tang of formaldehyde and chlorine bleach. Odors that no amount of laundry or cleaning could explain. She heard strange noises late at night. The final straw came when she, tidying up, discovered a human skull in a suitcase. She confronted him, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and maternal authority. He offered a lame, preposterous excuse, claiming it was a medical specimen, a prop from a school. But the illusion was shattered. The kind, grandmotherly sanctuary had been violated. Fearing for her own safety and horrified by what she might not know, she gave him an ultimatum. He had to leave. Once again, he was cast out. The last anchor to a normal, supervised life had been severed. In September of 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into his own apartment at 213 North 24th Street, Apartment 4. It was a cramped, one-bedroom unit in a drab, brown brick building in a racially mixed, low-income neighborhood known as the Oxford Apartments. For the monster, it was perfect. It was his ultimate lair, a place of absolute privacy and control. There were no more grandmotherly eyes, no more familial expectations. The final, most horrific act of his life was about to begin on this small, claustrophobic stage. The quiet monster was finally, and terrifyingly, home. The apartment at 213 North 24th Street was, for Jeffrey Dahmer, the first true sanctuary of his adult life. It was a small, unassuming space, a living room, a bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a bathroom. The walls were thin, the carpets worn, but it was his. Here, the last vestiges of a performance for the outside world could be discarded. The silence within these walls was different from the tense silence of his childhood home. This was a silence he curated and controlled. He continued his work at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. The steady, monotonous rhythm of the night shift providing a bizarre counterpoint to his inner life. By day, he slept. By night, he worked or wandered the streets of Milwaukee. A solitary figure moving through the city's nocturnal landscape. His life had settled into a dual existence, a stark separation between the mundane and the monstrous. Within the confines of his apartment, his rituals deepened. His desire was no longer merely for companionship, but for a connection so absolute it defied the natural order. He began to experiment with ways to create a state of perfect submission, a fantasy born from a deep-seated terror of abandonment. He studied books on anatomy and pharmacology, applying a twisted, clinical logic to his pursuits. His goal was not simply to end life, but to suspend it in a state where the will of the other was erased, leaving only a permanent, compliant presence. These experiments, however, were fraught with failure. The substances he used were imprecise, the methods flawed. The outcomes were not what he sought, leaving him with the same profound loneliness, now compounded by a sense of futility. In the aftermath of these failures, he would be left with the physical remains. His response was to preserve, to keep tokens. He began a collection, not of objects of art, but of relics that to him represented the individuals he had desired. He cleaned and prepared these relics with a meticulous, almost reverent care, as if by preserving a physical part, he could hold onto the essence of the person, preventing them from leaving him entirely. The apartment itself began to bear the subtle, unseen weight of these activities. He used strong chemicals to manage odors, and the air was often thick with the scent of pine cleaner and incense. He acquired a large blue plastic barrel, which he told neighbors was for storing tanning liquids, a plausible explanation for a man so pale. The true purpose of the barrel was far darker, serving as a final repository for the physical evidence of his actions. Life in the Oxford apartments was a study in contrasts. Neighbors would hear the sound of his television, the normal clatter of a single man living his life. He was polite, quiet, and kept to himself. He attended church with his father on occasion, presenting a picture of a man seeking redemption. This facade of normality was so convincing that it rendered the horrific reality within apartment 4 invisible. The building was full of people, yet he existed in a bubble of complete isolation, his inner world walled off from the community around him. There were moments when this bubble nearly burst. On one occasion, a young man managed to escape his apartment, disoriented and in distress. The police were called. Dahmer, with a chilling calm, met the officers in the hallway. He explained the situation away with a story of a drunken lover's quarrel. His demeanor was so placid, his account so mundane, that the officers accepted his word without question. They returned the confused young man to his care, a tragic decision that highlighted the power of a bland facade over underlying horror. It was a catastrophic failure of the system, a moment where intuition was silenced by a convincing performance of normalcy. For nearly 3 years, this was the pattern of his existence. The cycle of work, solitude, and his private rituals continued. The collection in his apartment grew, a silent museum of his loneliness. He lived in a state of constant tension, managing his public persona while tending to his dark, private world. The hunger for that perfect, unbreakable connection remained, driving him forward in a cycle that seemed to have no end. A quiet, desperate man in a small apartment, trying and failing to solve the problem of his own profound alienation. The summer of 1991 draped itself over Milwaukee, a heavy, humid blanket that seemed to muffle the city's sounds and slow its pace. In the Oxford apartments, the air in Jeffrey Dahmer's unit was particularly still, thick with the cloying sweetness of cheap incense struggling to mask a deeper, more persistent undertone, a stale, chemical smell that clung to the curtains and the worn carpet. For nearly 3 years, this small, claustrophobic space had been the absolute center of his universe, a kingdom of one, governed by a logic so internalized and distorted that it felt, to him, like simple necessity. The outside world, the chatter of neighbors through the walls, the distant wail of sirens, the cheerful jingle of an ice cream truck, had become a faint, irrelevant backdrop to the intense, consuming drama of his inner life. His existence had settled into a rhythm as predictable as the shifting of light through his perpetually drawn blinds. The night shift at the chocolate factory provided a structure, a reason to move through the city under the cover of darkness. He would walk to and from work, a tall, lanky figure with a hesitant gait, his eyes often downcast, avoiding contact. To his coworkers, he was simply quiet, a bit odd, but harmless. They knew nothing of the frantic energy that sometimes buzzed beneath his placid surface, the desperate need to fill the silence that awaited him at home. The factory was a reprieve. The the monotonous rumble of machinery, the warm, overwhelming scent of melting cocoa. These things demanded no emotional engagement. He could lose himself in the simple, physical task of his work, a temporary anesthesia, but returning to the apartment was always a return to the core of his being, to the loneliness. The silence there was not empty, it was, to him, actively demanding. It was a presence that needed to be filled. His attempts to fill it had evolved into a complex and tragic ritual. He was no longer merely acting on impulse. He was conducting a grim, repetitive experiment, the goal of which remained eternally out of reach. He sought not just to possess, but to transform. His reading had expanded beyond anatomy texts to include books on witchcraft and zombie lore, a search for any methodology, any arcane secret that could grant him the power to achieve his ultimate desire, a permanent, submissive companion. He wanted to create a being that was both alive and entirely his, a creature of his own will, who would look at him with eyes that saw only him, who would never have a thought or a desire that he did not sanction. This fantastical goal was pursued with a chilling, mundane practicality. He kept detailed notes, not of his feelings or his turmoil, but of his methods, his dosages, his failures. He was like a dedicated but doomed inventor, each attempt ending not in a breakthrough, but in the same grim outcome. The failure was not just a practical one. It was a profound personal rejection. Each time, the universe, or the fundamental laws of biology and consciousness, refused to grant his wish. The person would be lost, and he would be left, once again, with the hollow consolation of a relic, his collection of Polaroid photographs, his boxes of carefully cleaned and prepared tokens, were a museum of these failures. They were not trophies of success, but tombstones for connections that had never truly been made. The strain of maintaining this double life was beginning to show. The compartmentalization, once a skill he had mastered, was becoming more difficult. He became more reckless, more desperate. The encounters became more frequent. The need was like a thirst that no amount of water could quench, because the thirst was not for water, but for something else entirely, something that perhaps did not exist in the way he imagined it. He started visiting bars more often, his approach less cautious. The polite, shy facade was sometimes cracked by a palpable sense of urgency that could make people uneasy. It was during this period of escalating desperation that the outside world, so long held at bay, began to intrude with greater force. Neighbors complained more persistently to the landlord about the smells. There was the incident with the young Laotian boy, Conrack Synthesophone, which had so nearly ended everything. The memory of that night, boy's disoriented state, the arrival of the police, the heart-stopping fear of discovery, and then the miraculous, unbelievable reprieve as the officers accepted his story and even helped usher the boy back into his apartment should have been a warning. It should have been a moment of clarity, a sign that his luck was a finite resource. But for Dahmer, it had the opposite effect. It reinforced his sense of invulnerability, his belief that the world was blind, that his performance of normality was impenetrable. The close call did not spur him to stop. It seemed to quiet the last vestiges of caution, whispering to him that he could continue, that he was protected by the sheer unwillingness of society to see what was hidden in plain sight. The final unraveling began, as such things often do, not with a grand event, but with a small miscalculation. On the evening of July 22, 1991, he encountered Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man, near the Grand Avenue Mall. Dahmer's approach was the same as always, friendly, offering money for photographs, the promise of a few beers. Edwards, looking for a way to pass the time, agreed. They walked back to the Oxford apartments, the summer night air warm around them. Inside apartment 4, Dahmer offered him a drink. The ritual was beginning anew, but something was different this time. Perhaps it was the heightened tension in Dahmer's demeanor, a nervous energy that he could not fully conceal. Perhaps it was a survival instinct in Edwards, a sudden, clear perception of the wrongness of the situation that cut through the social awkwardness and the influence of alcohol. When Dahmer produced a pair of handcuffs and suggested they play a game, the mood in the room shifted from uneasy to dangerous. Edwards, feeling a primal surge of fear, refused. Dahmer's calm facade fractured. The frustration of his endless failures, the rage at this latest rejection, boiled over. He brandished a large knife. What followed was not a calculated act, but a frantic struggle. Edwards, fueled by adrenaline and the will to live, fought back with a strength that seemed to surprise his assailant. In the chaotic scuffle, he managed to shove Dahmer away, break free, and bolt for the door. He stumbled out into the hallway, the handcuffs still dangling from one wrist, the sound of his own panicked breathing loud in his ears. He didn't stop running until he saw the flashing lights of a police car on the street below, a beacon of the mundane world he had so narrowly escaped. This time, there would be no convincing performance when the police, led by a skeptical but attentive Officer Routh, returned to apartment 4 with Edwards. They found the door unlocked. The smell that hit them was unmistakable and overwhelming. A putrid wave that told a story words could not. Dahmer was calm, too calm, but his explanations were rambling, contradictory. He claimed the handcuffs were a joke. He said the smell was from a spoiled ham, but the officer's eyes were already scanning the small, cluttered room, and the pieces of a horrifying puzzle began to snap into place. A photograph of a dismembered body on the floor, the gleaming, polished skulls on a shelf, the large, blue drum in the corner from which the most potent odor emanated. The quiet kingdom was breached. The silence was shattered by the static of police radios, the sharp questions of detectives, the eventual wail of the medical examiner's van. As the investigation unfolded over the following days, the full, staggering scope of his actions became clear. The city of Milwaukee, the state of Wisconsin, and the nation were plunged into a state of collective shock and horror. How could this have happened? How could one man in the heart of a major city have carried out such a sustained and brutal series of acts without being stopped? The questions echoed in the press, in the living rooms of ordinary citizens, and in the hallways of power. The arrest was not an end, but a beginning of a different kind of reckoning for the families of the victims. It was the end of agonizing uncertainty and the beginning of a long, painful journey through grief and the search for justice. For the city, it was a moment of profound shame and self-examination, a scrutiny of its police department, its social services, its very soul. And for Jeffrey Dahmer, the man at the center of the storm, it was the final collapse of the elaborate fiction he had built around himself. The silence he had tried so desperately to fill was now replaced by the deafening noise of public outrage, legal procedure, and the cold, hard reality of a prison cell. The monster had been captured, but the echoes of his loneliness would reverberate for a long, long time. The world, once so oblivious to the quiet man in apartment 4, now could not look away. The arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer was not merely the capture of a criminal. It was the tearing away of a veil, revealing a darkness that seemed to challenge the very notion of an ordered society. The subsequent legal proceedings were a spectacle, but a somber one, a necessary and painful public ritual to process the incomprehensible. The courtroom became a theater of contrasting realities. On one side sat the families of the victims, their grief a palpable, heavy presence in the air. Their loss was not abstract. It was the empty chair at the dinner table, the voice that would never be heard again, a future stolen. They were the human faces of the statistics, a devastating reminder of the true cost of the defendant's actions. And on the other side was Jeffrey Dahmer himself. He did not fit the popular image of a monster. He appeared calm, placid, almost detached. He sat quietly through the proceedings, often taking notes on a yellow legal pad, as if he were a scholar observing a fascinating case study rather than the central figure in a tragedy of his own making. His demeanor was not one of defiance or pride, but of a strange, unsettling acceptance. When he spoke, his voice was soft, his words measured. He did not deny the charges. Instead, he confessed, providing detailed, clinical accounts of his actions. His confession was not a performance of remorse in the conventional, emotional sense. It was a statement of facts, an attempt, perhaps, to finally articulate the logic of his own private hell. The core legal question was not one of guilt, but of sanity. His defense attorneys, following the path of the legal system, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. They argued that the sheer magnitude and nature of his crimes were evidence of a mind so fractured, so divorced from reality, that he could not be held morally responsible. They spoke of his profound mental illnesses, his paraphilias, his necrophilia, painting a picture of a man driven by compulsions he could neither understand nor control. The prosecution, however, argued for his sanity. They pointed to his methodical nature, his ability to plan and lure his victims, his cunning in evading police detection, his clear understanding of the difference between right and wrong as defined by law. He knew his actions were illegal, they argued. He simply chose to commit them. He had held a job, interacted with neighbors, and presented a facade of normality for years. This, they contended, was not the behavior of someone lost in a psychotic break, but of someone making calculated, if horrifying, choices. Dahmer himself seemed to side with the prosecution. He expressed a desire to be found sane, to avoid the indefinite confinement of a mental institution, and instead face the finality of a prison sentence. For him, death was the ultimate silence, the end he perhaps saw as the only fitting conclusion to his torment. He showed flickers of what could be interpreted as remorse, telling the court he wanted to die so that the families could have relief, and that his own death would prevent him from being a magnet for the media for the rest of his life. It was a complex, messy picture, a man seemingly aware of the horror he had caused, yet emotionally disconnected from it, his motivations remaining opaque even under the brightest lights of public scrutiny. The jury's task was Herculean. They had to peer into the abyss of another human being's mind and make a judgment. After weeks of harrowing testimony, they deliberated and returned with a verdict. He was found sane and guilty on 15 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, a total of 957 years, ensuring he would never walk free again. The gavel fell, and the legal chapter was closed. Jeffrey Dahmer was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. His life behind bars was as quiet and uneventful as his outer life had once appeared. He was a model prisoner, causing no trouble. He was baptized by a fundamentalist minister in a prison whirlpool, an event that sparked debate about the nature of redemption and whether it could ever encompass such acts. He claimed to have found God and expressed regret for his actions, though the sincerity and depth of this conversion remained a mystery known only to him and his God. He spent his days reading, working a prison job, and existing in the rigid, predictable routine of incarceration. The frantic hunger that had driven him was now contained, muted by the unyielding structure of prison life. But the violence he had unleashed upon the world had a momentum of its own, and it eventually found its way back to him on November 28, 1994, just over 3 years into his sentence. Dahmer was assigned to clean the prison gymnasium with another inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver, a man with his own severe mental illnesses and a life sentence for murder, bludgeoned Dahmer and another inmate to death with a metal bar. The news was met with a complex, somber silence. There was no celebration, only a grim sense of an inevitable, circular conclusion. The story that had begun with such violence ended with it. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer is not a simple one. He was a source of macabre fascination, a name that became synonymous with the ultimate evil. But to reduce him to merely a monster is to miss the more unsettling and perhaps more important lesson of his life. His story is a dark tapestry woven from many threads. Profound childhood neglect and loneliness, a family system that failed to see his deepening distress, a mental illness that festered in the dark, and a series of societal failures, from schools to the army to the police, that missed chance after chance to intervene. He was a human black hole whose internal emptiness became so vast and powerful that it began to consume everything around it. His crimes were a desperate, horrifying, and ultimately futile attempt to fill a void that could not be filled by possession or control. He sought connection in the only way his broken psyche could conceive, creating a perverse kingdom of the dead in a vain attempt to escape the terror of being alone. As you drift towards sleep, let the story be a somber lullaby on the nature of silence. It reminds us that the quietest people can sometimes harbor the most turbulent storms. It speaks to the profound human need for connection and the terrifying shapes that need can take when it is twisted by neglect and illness. The quiet monster is gone, but his story remains as a chilling echo, a reminder to listen more closely to the silences around us and to the silent struggles within. The city of Milwaukee sleeps now, the lake beside it calm and dark, holding its secrets under a blanket of stars. The noise has faded, and all is quiet once more. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer has now been told, not in a spirit of sensationalism, but as a slow, somber meditation on the deepest shadows of the human experience. As the details of his life and crimes recede into the past, they leave behind not just a legacy of horror, but a series of unsettling echoes, questions that linger in the quiet moments. His life stands as a stark testament to the profound consequences of unseen loneliness. It was a loneliness that began as a small, quiet seed in a troubled childhood, watered by neglect and misunderstanding, until it grew into a monstrous, consuming tree whose roots strangled everything in its path. Dahmer was not born a monster. He was, tragically, constructed piece by piece through a failure of connection. His story forces us to acknowledge the silent struggles that so many endure behind closed doors and placid facades. It is a reminder that the most dangerous isolation is often the one that goes unnoticed, the one that festers in plain sight, masked by a semblance of normalcy. The relentless machinery of the city, the routines of work and life, continued around him, oblivious. This, too, offers a lesson that society's gaze can sometimes be blind to what it does not wish to see, that individuals on the margins can too easily slip through the cracks of a system designed for the mainstream. The true horror of his story may not lie solely in the acts themselves, but in the chilling number of opportunities there were to stop them. Opportunities lost to prejudice, oversight, or a simple, tragic inability to believe that such darkness could reside in such an ordinary vessel. Now, as we bring this narrative to a close, it is time to let go of these heavy thoughts. The story is over. The courtroom has fallen silent. The prison cell is empty, and the echoes have faded. There is no more need to analyze, to question, or to fear. So, let the weight of this tale drift away from your mind. Let it dissipate like mist on the surface of a still, dark lake. Outside your window, the world is at rest. The moon hangs silent in the vast, indifferent sky, and the stars are mere pinpricks of distant light. The wind whispers softly through the trees, a gentle lullaby that has soothed generations to sleep. All is calm. All is quiet. Feel the soft support of your pillow beneath your head. Notice the gentle rhythm of your own breathing in and out, a steady and peaceful constant. The day is done. Its worries, its stories, its sounds, all are receding now, replaced by a deep and welcoming stillness. There is only this moment, this comfort, this quiet. Let your eyelids grow heavy. Let the darkness behind them be a soft, comfortable blanket. You are safe. You are at peace. The world is sleeping, and it is time for you to sleep too. Drift away, let go, and fall into a deep and dreamless rest.